Hello, Ariel, welcome.
Sorry, I just realized I didn't have on my sound or video.
No worries. I'm gonna bring you to the top. How are you doing? Happy Friday. Thank you so much for joining us and for doing this. And I just mentioned to everyone that last week we had Jane, who's a senior photo editor, and she was giving us best practices with pitching. If you missed last week's event, just reach out to me. I can send you a recap of the recording. And also, Jane gave some resources of just like stories that she received as pitches and what she published and what she was working on. And so I'm happy to send that over. I'll drop my email in the chat. But Ariel, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, I'm super happy to be here. I want to like really kind of use this time to be like the best resource I can be for you guys. So I'm gonna kind of like give you a little bit of like my history, starting with like how I kind of got to this position and all the steps that kind of like led up to it, and then give you some just kind of like general things that I see a lot of the times when people are kind of like first starting out. But I want to spend most of the time just like really answering any questions that you guys have, or any like career path questions, or any, even like basic things like contracts or invoices or rates or things like that. And kind of just use the time that way. So my history, I was thinking about this a lot this morning, where like I feel like careers are really like you're kind of taught that they're these linear things, and really they're sort of these like circuitous strange paths where like you find yourself not, or at least for me, like not following like something like super linear. And so I grew up in a pretty artistic family. We had this weird little like kind of like circus adjacent show when I was growing up, where we would travel up and down the East Coast, and through that we obviously had like a lot of like artist friends, and my parents were really heavily involved in the arts. And through that, basically, I had my parents had a friend who was a photographer, and I was always very interested in photography and in the arts. Um, I was also from a very young age, like super kind of obsessed with magazines. I really, although I don't think I would be able to articulate it then, I always really liked this idea of like words, which I really loved, and like pictures, which I really loved, kind of in this like weird marriage. And I think like magazines and kind of like printed material in a way were kind of like unique in that, like they both kind of needed each other in order to exist. And I always really loved that, and especially loved celebrity and fashion magazines. Was like that was like totally like, was always reading them. Um, so always had this kind of like vague idea that at one point I wanted to work in a magazine in some capacity, although never was quite sure like what that looked like, or sort of like how to get there. And I had a friend who was like working for another photographer. His photography career was kind of just starting. And we were sort of talking one day, and I was kind of like, I don't know what I'm doing with my life. But I was not, so I feel like photo editors oftentimes will come to photography because they are photographers. And I was really never that way. I was always, flirted with photography, dabbled in photography, but was always like pretty self-aware about kind of like my own limitations and sort of talent limitations. So this friend basically was like, you're very organized, and you're like good at dealing with difficult people. Have you ever thought about going into photo production? Which I'd never heard about. So interviewed with like a couple of different production houses about being a PA, and then basically started like met a guy who was an agent, a photo agent, here in New York, moved to New York from Philadelphia and started working for this really small agency that that had represented sort of like a lot of big artists for almost their entire career, like through the 90s and early aughts. Sort of started there thinking like, oh, I'll do this for 1 year and then I'll transition into magazines. And then the crisis of 2008 hit, and like many magazines folded within, you know, a very short period of time. And also like rates basically went crazy. Like I remember one time at this job we were doing like a movie poster, and like the same company, the same scope of work used to be like a $30,000 day rate, and then like the next month it was a $10,000 day rate because the rates just like fell so precipitously. So I ended up basically staying at this job for 5 years out of the, you know, the one that I had planned, which turned out to be fantastic because it was so small. It was just a company of 3 people, and I was able to like really hone my photo production skills, and worked on a lot of like big projects that I think at a different agency I probably wouldn't have had the opportunity to do. Partially just because there was no one else there to do it, and so they were sort of like, okay, like now's your moment. Then finally, you know, still kind of had this like editorial itch, but didn't really have like the creative background, like the editorial background. So started this like little independent magazine as a way of kind of like getting that experience. It was like this weird surf and art magazine that I did with my husband, then boyfriend, now husband. And so when I finally like finally like after 6 years, there was kind of like I was ready to move on. There was a job opening at Entertainment Weekly. Actually, I was able to kind of show my production skills, show that I had these kind of like business credentials from working at the agency, and like, you know, understood how to negotiate rates, budgets, estimates, doing all that stuff. And then I had this like editorial side where I had sort of demonstrated that that I could kind of like think creatively about how to present the shoots, and ended up, you know, going there and staying there I think for another 4 years. Really loved that job. Left it for a fashion job, which I was very good at and was absolutely not the place for me, and stayed there for under a year. And when I left, I was positively convinced that I would never work in the industry again because I had left so quickly this other job. And I was like, I'm never working again. Like I've just ruined my entire career. And then basically after like I had sort of done a bunch of interviews at Business Week over the years that I was at EW, and then landed here eventually as the deputy, and then in 2018 became the photo director. So that's kind of like the career trajectory that I had, which is probably very longer than you wanted to hear, but just to kind of like sort of highlight some of like the turning points and some of like my backgrounds, just, you know, both in terms of like, how do you fund an independent project? How do you manage big productions, things like that. Some of the things I think, like when I see a lot of like sort of newer photographers coming into the industry, I think like a lot of the questions that people have are about how do you get clients? How do you kind of like break into that? A lot of questions about just like invoicing and things like that. I think when I was thinking about it, you know, leading up to this talk, one of the things I think I see a lot of people do is like leave money on the table simply because of being like mildly disorganized, or sort of just like not having like sort of loose like bookkeeping skills. So yeah, sort of things like that. Yeah, I guess I just want to kind of know, like, starting there, if there are any things that people are sort of like itching to hear about or want to know, or like questions that you guys have, and kind of like where you're at in terms of your careers.
Well, first, thank you
Oh,
for giving.
sorry, the chats.
No worries. Thank you for giving that background, because I think it's so important to us, for folks to understand that. I mean, simply put, that you didn't just wake up and become the director of photography. That took steps to get there, and you know what that actually entails, because I think people just don't realize what maybe that means. We did have some questions submitted from email first that I will start with.
Great.
From Liz. And please correct me if I'm not saying your name right. But they asked, well, there's 3 questions to start with. But one, what should be included in a client questionnaire? If you are able to speak on that. What things should always be included in photography contracts? Because you mentioned, you know, how photographers can leave money on the table by not being able to, you know, manage the business side of things, that housekeeping, like that management stuff. But what should be included in contracts? And in what ways can photographers that have recently started their business improve their workflow, which kind of touches on your point earlier?
Yeah, so contracts actually, that is a really good place to start. So I'll start there. And again, like most of what I can speak to, I do have a history in advertising, as well, obviously from like working at the photo agency, and also just from our magazine. That was how we basically funded it, was through doing special projects basically with clients like Nike and Patagonia and places like that. And so I'm used to reading them from like sort of the client end as well. And then the editorial contracts from, you know, from when I was at EW, Harper's Bazaar, and now here. So for editorial, there are kind of so the client basically is always responsible for giving you the contract. And if you have any, if they don't do that, you should definitely feel empowered to ask them for that and say, you know, my first piece of advice is like, don't do anything without a contract, because in that contract will be, you know, like your image usage rights, who owns the image rights, what your terms of payment are. So is it you know, are you getting paid when you hand over the film? Are you getting paid in 30 days after invoice? Are you getting paid in 45 days after invoice? And the contracts are usually like pretty like tedious to read through, but they're not like, I think there's kind of like a mystery around reading contracts. And they're pretty straightforward. The language in it is pretty straightforward. The 2 most common contracts that you'll encounter in the editorial space are what's called a work for hire contract, which is basically the client owns the rights to the pictures. This is not the contract that we have. Photo editors in the world really hate this contract. Photographers really hate this contract. The only people that it really serves are like the big businesses that that do this. And what that means basically is like, that shoot belongs to, like, I'm trying to like say you shoot for, I don't even know, like W magazine or something like that. All of that work belongs to W. It's again it's very standard. It doesn't mean that you can't like show it to on your website, or you can't show it on your Instagram, things like that. But it does become more challenging if you go to like resell the images, which is another way that people in the editorial space kind of like make money off of image making. There's kind of the initial like job that you get, and then there's kind of this whole secondary market of reselling the images and reselling archives and reuse of the images. The other set of contracts basically is just sort of like not work for hire, which is what we have. And in those, it'll sort of give you an idea of like what the usage intention is. So our contract, for instance, reads that it's one-time use tied to the story. It can be reused with international subsidiaries as long as it's in the context of the story. A lot of magazines too, editorial publications will have partnerships or international editions. Like we have Business Week Mexico, for instance, but we also have all these like subsidiaries that are not called Business Week, but run native language stories in like Poland and and Thailand and places like that. So those are the kinds of things that you kind of want to read in the contract. And all contracts are essentially negotiable to a certain degree. And I think if there's something in the contract that you're reading and you're like, this is not, I feel really uncomfortable with this, you should feel free to like mark it in the contract and ask your client about it. Ask your photo editor or your client or whoever you're working with to say, is this necessary? Do I have to do this? I have questions about this. What does this mean? And feel free to kind of like to ask those questions. And sometimes you'll get it out, and sometimes you won't. But at least you've sort of like advocated for yourself. So that's kind of contracts. What were the other two questions? I'm so sorry. I've lost my
train. No, you're fine. I threw it at you. I think that's great to actually say, because I think as photographers, we get these contracts and we think this is final say. But no, you can actually say, oh, I don't want to get paid in 60 days. I want to get paid at least 30 days. Like you can negotiate that, hopefully. And it's good to know that there is room and nothing is final. And so I'm really glad that you said that, because I don't think you can go without saying. Let me pull up those two questions real quick. Sorry. I mistakenly exit out of your questions list. But is that helpful, Liz? You can feel free to unmute yourself if you want more clarification on the contract aspect. But the other two questions were, what should be included in client questionnaires? I'm not sure if you can speak on that, but and in what ways can photographers that have recently started their business improve their workflow?
Sorry, can someone just explain a little bit what the client questionnaire is? Is that like when?
Yeah, I think for me, I see that as differently. I hear photographers right before, they want to do a shoot with someone, they're feeling the client out, the client's feeling you out. And so you send them a questionnaire about like what they are looking for. I think that's like what my understanding of it is. Liz, I'm not sure if you want any more clarification, or if you want to unmute yourself and provide that clarification, I should say. If you're still listening.
Yeah, I can.
Okay.
So from what I've heard, like I've been doing a whole bunch of research on this, and I've seen other photographers like give out client questionnaires to like kind of, just get a feel of their client and like how they may want their photos to look, like if they have a color scheme, things of that nature. And I didn't know if like you use that also.
We don't really use that. And in my experience, even with like the like with advertising as well, what usually happens is the client actually will give you a brief. Like the way that it works here is we actually provide the we're responsible basically for providing the initial creative direction and saying like, hey, like Liz, we love like this style of your work. This is the vibe we're going for. This is like the kind of like message that we're sending with this, oh, this is a really playful story, or like this ad campaign needs to be like stark black and white because it's, it's all about sort of like the seriousness of the shoe or something like that. And then usually what will happen is you'll get on a creative call with the client, and kind of like have a conversation. And, usually, hopefully there's time before the shoot, to pass back and forth references so that you kind of like pretty much have it dialed in. Again, like depending on like what space you're working in, if it's advertising or if it's like more kind of like celebrity or fashion, sometimes you'll even bring those kind of like references that you and the client have sort of agreed upon. You'll bring them to set and kind of like post them up on the wall and stuff like that, so that everybody that's there, from like, from the person you're shooting to the client, to the hair, makeup, styling, the assistants, the props people, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, has like a pretty concrete understanding of like what the goal is of the shoot and what the intended outcome is going to be. So I've never had to submit a questionnaire to the client, but I think, questions you can definitely ask are like, what's the overall mood? Like, what are we trying to say here? Like, what are like references from my site that if I delivered this, you would, come back super, super happy. What, yeah, color palette is great, especially if you're like working with, still life or fashion or, advertising, like what colors are we using? All of those things I think are really valid, but they should really come to you in a pretty clear way in the beginning, saying like, this is the scope of work. Are you available and are you interested? And that should kind of, in an ideal world, like flow into a conversation so that your voice is really brought to the table and their needs are met, and you guys kind of like both walk away from the experience like pretty satisfied creatively, and go into it with a very clear understanding of like what the goals and aims are. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
That's great. And then lastly from Liz, any tips or tools or resources that you use for workflow that you recommend us to use?
Yeah. So again, I can't speak to really like to workflow in terms of like photo editing and stuff like that, but in terms of just the other stuff, Google Calendar, always your friend. Like, that's understanding like when creative calls are happening, when when shoots are happening, when deadlines are happening. Just, as soon as you get those, just mark them down in a calendar, so that you have a record of like what the client wants. Also, creating an invoice system for yourself so that all your invoices live in a certain place, or using a program like, my gosh, I'm blanking on the one that like QuickBooks or something like that. QuickBooks, I think, is actually really affordable and it's pretty easy to use, and it tracks it, and it also tells you when your invoices are overdue or coming up. And I think you can, even for the clients, you can mark like what their terms are, if it's net 30, net 45, whatever. And it generates for you, it'll like, if you set it, it'll automatically generate like an email to say like, hey, like you haven't paid me. If you don't want to, pay for those programs or things like that, for a long time when we had Wax, I just did it off of, using Google Drive basically, and Google Invoices. They have really good templates, and you just number them. And again, like set a reminder on your Google Calendar to say, I need to call Ariel at Business Week by April 30th if I'm not paid. And I think that's what I mean. We're like, it requires, like being a photographer it's so funny. It's like, it requires so many admin skills that I think like are definitely not taught in photo school. It's like, there's the creative side, but then there's like this pretty heavy administrative side. And that's what I mean when I say, like, I see a lot of people leave things on the money on the table, simply because they don't set up a system for themselves. Also, uploading, getting a little scan app on your phone and uploading all of your receipts so that they automatically go to a drive so that you can track all that stuff at the end of the year when you go do your taxes. Because if you're working as a photographer, so much is considered sort of like a business expense. But if you don't have those receipts and you're not sort of tracking them, you can't really claim them. So I don't, I think everybody kind of makes their own system. Again, I really love QuickBooks. I think it's really easy and I think it's worth every penny. But a lot of it is just kind of like setting up a system that works for you and then following through on it as well.
So helpful. And I agree because trust me, I hate this admin stuff. I feel like when they say that business is really 90% of the game, that they mean it. And now I'm really starting to understand that it really does take up like 90% of your time doing the business stuff. Thank you for that. I see 2 questions in the chat from Karen that I will ask right now. I see one of CRM. Should photographers have a CRM?
What is a CRM? I've never encountered it.
Karen, do you want to unmute yourself and clarify?
Oh, a client. Oh, I see. Yeah, I mean, I think if that works for you, I think everybody kind of works in a different way. And I think if that works for you, like, it depends on how many clients you have too. I know that it works for, yeah, I'm definitely going to get to rates as well. I think it works for big, basically every agent has one, you know what I mean? I think it really depends on you and your how you work and your personality. I don't think it's necessarily necessary, but I think the more you can kind of, because like Polly was saying, the business side of this, it's gets so big that the more you can kind of automate that stuff, as long as it works for you and as long as you follow through, the better. So totally, it's not totally necessary to have one, but I think if it makes your life easier and it's going to help you follow through and make things like invoicing and all that stuff easier, absolutely do it.
Totally. Definitely goes back to you're saying, whatever works best for you. Second question is, how should an invoice best be constructed?
So invoices, it's funny because this is another thing with a lot of new photographers starting out. They there's a lot of things that end up being missing. So the things that are really important to have on the invoice, obviously your name, your address where you want the money sent, your social security or your EIN, your business number, the net, so the terms of the payment. So again, on receipt, net 30, net 45, whatever that is. Contact information, because a lot of the times there will be questions about the invoice that an AP person will have. So telephone number and email address, the address and name and address, business address of your client, and then your rate, and and expenses, anything like that. So I'd put day rate first, any expenses, any if you got an advance, just remember to put that as well, minus whatever, $1,000 advance, whatever, and then your the total owed to you from the client. And some of the stuff too, I'm happy to give you invoice templates and things like that from when I had to make invoices and stuff like that. But always make sure that how you need to get paid, basically, the address that it needs to go to, or the bank account information, transfer information, however you want to get paid, make sure that information is on there. Also make sure your contact information is on there as well.
Awesome. I will connect with you afterwards, Ariel, and get that template and send it out to everyone who registered. So don't worry. I can definitely grab that from her later. And I mean, it's also, you know, another cheat would be just to ask that, you know, your client or whoever you worked for, you know, what they need included, because sometimes they may vary what information that they need on the invoice. So, but I think you listed everything. That's a very thorough invoice. Just going through the next questions. I see you wanted to talk about rates, and I see a question about that from Evelyn. How do you figure out what to charge, or do you calculate it by hours, or do you do a fixed price? Is there a place to get some kind of comparison price list?
Yes, I'm very happy to talk about this. If Lenore is still on here, she will also. I know. If Lenore is on here, she'll tell you that that I have very strong feelings about this. Okay, so again, I'm going to sort of talk editorially and the little, you know, what I know from advertising as well. Usually with any job, if you're working with like a bigger company, and I'll talk about kind of like more independent companies in a minute, or like whatever, like just smaller jobs, but I'm going to start with the big jobs. So usually they'll come to you and you'll say, hey, like this, I'll just use us for an example. Hey, listen, Mackenzie, I really want you to shoot this nurse who, you know, her IUD failed and she's suing the government basically for pain and suffering. It needs to be shot on Wednesday. Our day rate is $850. I need the film by Thursday. I need the low res images by Thursday. Every magazine usually has their own rate. Ours is $850, which is kind of considered like a good editorial rate. Others, like I think when I was at EW, I think our day rate was $250, but they had a different structure at that time, which is called, you get a day rate and then it's against space, which means if your image ran, if we took 11 images and we ran them all full page, then that would be another, like, I think like $1,200 per page that you were paid. If your image goes on the cover, that's an additional, you know, and again, like talking about EW at that time, I think it was like an additional $5,000. So some clients will work like that, where editorial clients, where the day rate is lower, but they put against space basically, which is what that means. And it's if it runs half page, you'll get a certain amount of money. If you get, you know, 2/3, it'll be a certain amount of money. And full page, it'll be a certain amount of money. And again, like these are things like when somebody comes to you and it's like, hey, like I really want you to shoot this, absolutely ask about the rates, and don't be afraid to ask about that, because it's really important to know, like, can I afford to do this job? And like, is it going to kind of be worth it? In addition to like, do I really want to do it? Our pay structure is $850 for day rate, an additional $250 if we're doing video, basically, like we do a lot of B-roll video and kind of like little social videos and stuff like that. You can also charge for things like travel, like if the shoot is 2 hours away, for instance, you know, you can charge mileage and gas, food, any equipment that you have to rent or purchase. What else is like kind of like legit food? Did I say food already? Sorry. Insurance, if you have to get, you know, insurance, or like say you're traveling internationally and you have to get like a visa, or you have to get, you know, shots or something like that. Like anything basically that goes towards the job, you can charge.
Assistance, Ariel, assistance.
Assistance, sorry, thank you. Yes, assistance. Things like that. Some clients will give you, if you're putting out a lot of money, they will give you an advance. With advertising, advances are usually 100% of the expenses. So if you're spending, you know, $10,000 because you have to rent the studio, you have to like do X, Y, and Z, you're traveling to Australia or whatever with a crew of 3 people, and you have to bring all this equipment. Usually the client will put that up front. Editorial, again, it depends. Like news, not really so many advances. We don't really do them because we're financial services and there's like all these barriers or whatever, but but yeah, advertising, usually 100% of it, your expenses, and also like 50% of your rate. Advertising too, the rates will be much higher, usually because they're going to take all the images and they own them in perpetuity. It's kind of the thinking behind that. And they should come to you with like what the budget is for that job and like what the rate is. So like say they're like, I don't know, we're shooting like a Target ad. We have $12,000 a day for it. It's a 2-day shoot, a total shoot, with models, everything. We have to come in at like, whatever, $100,000. This is kind of the photo budget that we see. And then you'll put together an estimate, and you'll submit it, and you guys will probably bicker over it a little bit. And then they'll approve it. And that's kind of like, that's what you have to stay in line with. And same thing with editorial, we'll say like, this is the money we have, like, can you do it for this, or can you not do it for this? And you'll say like, no, I need like an extra $200 because I have to bring a second assistant. Or you'll be like, yeah, it's a really simple job. I'm just going to go to this person's house and shoot her really quick. And this money sounds great. So that's kind of like when you're working with like a bigger company, where they'll have kind of infrastructure and stuff like that. Social media is like a whole other thing too, which I'm a little bit embarrassed to say, when I left in the agency in 2012 or something like that, it was like just starting to like be a question. So I'm a little bit like, don't know as much about that, but there's a whole fee structure with that, and like how many images you're providing a day, how many posts they're doing per day. And a lot of this will be in the contract too, but always ask your client ask your client all the questions. You know what I mean? They if you have a question, like just totally ask them. When you're doing kind of like more independent work, I think that you should set a rate for yourself. I think your rate should be probably 20% more than what you think it is, at least. Don't be afraid to also, when you're setting that rate, like don't kind of like be too humble about it, I think, and I think that if you're coming to this with like institutional knowledge as well, then that is also worth something. And so I think, you should say like, okay, this job is going to take me like X hours, basically. I want my rate to be I think I'm worth $250 an hour for like my knowledge, my eye, my vision, my everything. You should totally be empowered to say that to the client, even if you know that like there's no way in hell they can do it. You can say like, hey, my normal rate is X, Y, and Z. I'm just kind of wondering like what you have realistically in your budget. If you think a job is going to be fast, like if it's going to be kind of like less than a day, then I would in that case charge either like a day rate or a project fee for that. And again, if you're like saying like, okay, my rate is $250 an hour, I need to be making, it's sort of not worth it for me unless I'm working at least 5 hours a day. Even if a job is only going to take you 2 hours, you just say, okay, for this job, it's going to be $1,125 for this job. I think it's always good to make, if it's like a project that you really love and you really, really, really want to do it, I think it's totally fine to be like, this person has $250 for the whole project. but I really believe in their project. I really want to do it. I think the images are going to be beautiful and I'm willing to kind of invest my time in it. So then what you do when you send them the invoice, you basically are like, okay, my normal rate is $250 per hour. I did 10 hours on this. And then you basically discount it at the end. So they understand for future projects, because you never know like where they're going to go or like, you know, what they're going to do. They understand that they sort of got a deal, you know what I mean? And that this isn't like, this is what I'm worth and I'm willing to do it for you for this because I want to, but like, this doesn't set a precedent. You know what I mean? This, I've told you my rate. I've been really, really clear. And should you come back to me, not saying I'm not going to do it for the lower rate again, but like, you understand like what I think my value is. Did I cover all that, Lenore?
Yeah. Yes, my child is screeching.
No,
But I just wanted to, can I just quickly interject that like editorial rates are much less negotiable than what Ariel is saying. So like this is for oh my God, I'm sorry.
No,
My child is screaming. Yes, like Bloomberg, I mean, Bloomberg is very generous. Like our rate is what it is. But like, if you go to the Times, their rate is what their rate is. If New York Magazine, their rate, like you can't go to New York Times and be like, well, actually my rate is $1,000 a day. And they'll be like, actually, we're going to go with someone else. Cause that's like, their rate is their rate and that's on the contract. But like, but everything else that Ariel said is spot on.
Right. Sorry, I should have clarified with that. Yeah. That's what I was saying. Like when you're working with like a company, like something like that, like a New York Times or like, you know, Condé Nast or any of those, they'll tell you the rate. And usually that's not negotiable. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't ask for like expenses that you need in order to get the job done. But and especially anymore, the rate, like it's pretty like, this is the rate, you know what I mean? For the day rate. You know, and again, like it's such a weird industry too, because especially editorial, like, you know, the budgets have been, they're like pretty set for the year, and they, you know, usually they're like they're never increasing, they're always decreasing. And so I think that's why kind of like in the editorial world, why there's like a pretty set hard rate for that. And the other thing is too, is like even the biggest photographers are working for that exact same rate that you're working for. So it doesn't matter if you're, you know, you know, shooting, I don't know, the cover of GQ, all the people that are shooting the cover of GQ are getting the exact same rate. Everybody that shoots for Business Week is getting the exact same rate, which in some ways is like kind of, it's sort of nice because there's some transparency there, you know, and it's like the photo editor is not going to like lie about it, you know, because, so that's kind of the nice part about like working, you know, with the Times or T Magazine or things like that. It's, you know, it's sort of is what it is. So. What other questions?
Yes, there's a bunch more in the chat. I will just touch on the ones that are still on the same topic. Let's see, there was one about, can you touch on what hazard pay could look like? And then when it comes to creative fees and licensing fees, should those be separate or together?
Yeah, okay, so hazard pay, this is a little bit of a, it kind of depends on, again, this is one thing that's going to change a little bit from client to client. Again, I think at this point, 1 year into the pandemic, which is like when hazard pay became sort of like more of a standard, I think that there are kind of like standardized rates. Ours is 200. If you are, you know, and I think if you're sort of like going into a situation that is, seems sort of less safe or something like for instance, if we're like, hey, can you like go into like this bar in Houston or something like that and like take a few shots of like of everybody there. If it's sort of like outside, everything is socially distanced, blah, blah, blah. Everybody kind of feels safe. We know that everybody's going to, you know, use PPE. then probably we won't have a hazard pay. But everybody kind of has their own thing, and it also depends too, like, like what kind of situation are you going into? So that's the answer to that. And then what was the other one?
Licensing and creative fees.
So creative fees would be basically your day rate. So again, like licensing and creative fees would basically go for mostly advertising or fashion clients. So yeah, you should put all of that into the contract. The licensing fees would happen usually after in a separate invoice based on like what the client chooses and how they run. So the licensing fees would basically be kind of like an after the fact thing once everything has kind of like gone to layout. It's like sort of out in the world. We have an understanding of exactly like what's being used and how it's being used. And those fees would basically be agreed upon in the contract beforehand. Like, is this being used on like a billboard or is it being used on social media? And each one of those would kind of have like a different rate. So usually those are two separate invoices, just because your creative fees you want to like bill back as soon as possible. And then the licensing fees you would want to do afterwards. Even again, like if it's against space, a lot of the times you're going to do a shoot in May that might not run until October. So you would want to send the invoice for the May shoot that you did, which would be like your day rate, any expenses that you have ASAP, so that you could get billed for that. And then once the magazine comes out, you would bill again for like space rates.
And then when it comes to the process, when it's a personal project and you want to pitch it, would this process still be the same?
Yes. So with personal projects, again, I'm not sure like how many people like saw Jane's talk last week. With a personal project, what you would do basically is, pitch it to a photo editor, or pitch it to, if you want to make a book or something like that. And then usually what will happen is there'll be like an agreed upon rate where we'll say like, we love this project, we want to basically run it in October. We have $5,000 for the project, or $3,500, or this is running on web only, like probably $1,200. And then you could sort of say like, those rates are a little less set, so you can sort of like negotiate a little bit on that stuff. And then, yeah, you would just kind of like agree upon the rate before it runs. And again, like if you feel like it's if it's more valuable than that, or you want to hold out for another client, or you think, whatever the reason is, like you can also say no,
Thank you. Adri asks, what's the best response if you are ghosted or shorted by a client?
Shorted by a client, I'm assuming means like they didn't pay you the full amount. And
right.
So
I'm assuming too.
Yeah. That's terrible. I would sort of politely but firmly just, call it to their attention. The ghosting by the client, if they're like ghosting you for payment, I would again, just politely keep asking. I would ask to talk to their AP, their accounts payable person, stuff like that. If it's sort of an independent client, I've never had that happen before. I think if they really ghost you, or they really short you, and they're really fighting you, then at some point, you have to get a lawyer, and you have to have them draft a letter, and it has to be mean and scary, and they have to, and then it'll sort of go from there. At some point in your careers, like when you get more established, especially if you are, earning a fair amount of money, you probably will want to be in touch with a lawyer anyways, just because you'll have contract questions, or you'll have some of that stuff. And, there are great lawyers out there that, work with artists all the time that are not like, $1,000 an hour, and sort of can help you. And some of them, will do pro bono work as well. So there are definitely resources out there for collecting on invoices that are underpaid or not paid. Yeah, but that's terrible if you are.
Mackenzie asked, let me go back to it. Sorry, I just lost it. What are best practices in setting terms of payment and sending images to clients, such as setting payment schedules? Earlier, you mentioned 30 to 60-day turnarounds for payment is typically what you have seen.
Yeah, so I, again, this goes back to just asking. And I think that there's totally like a straightforward and kind of polite way to say that, and just say, like, can you tell me like what your net is? And then if, like our net is 45 days. And so, you can say like, is there any way, is that negotiable at all? Or is there any way to sort of be paid, in 30 days, or to get the invoice paid a little bit earlier? And again, like most, especially in like the editorial world, like, or not even in most clients are part of this business because they really love photography and they love photographers. And I think, especially in the editorial space, like people want to help artists as much as they are able to, and so I think most people are really honest about it. And if they can say like, yeah, I'm going to see if I can rush this through, or like, let me talk to, my manager, or like, let me talk to our AP people and like get back to you and see if we can rush it through. They're being really honest about that. And if for some reason they can't, I think usually they're being really honest about that too. And usually it doesn't feel great for us to come back to you and say like, I'm so sorry, like I can't move the terms of the payment. I've tried, and our accountants basically just won't do it. So that's that. And there was a second part to that question. I'm sorry, I missed it.
I think that actually covered that question pretty well. I did have a follow-up to what you were saying about Adrian's question about being shorted. I know it may be different for editorial, but for example, I know when you're doing like independent contracts, you can actually say, oh, here's my late fee. Now, if you're working with Bloomberg and it's 46 days, like, are you able to put in your contract, there's a late fee, or is that different for editorial?
So in my experience, and this is just being really honest, people will put that in their contracts, that if it's past 45 days, like this is it's a 1% late fee for every week, 5% if it's like more than a month due, which absolutely you should put that in your contracts. I think even in California, that is you're actually able to collect that late fee. I think in other states it's much, much, much harder. I think you can absolutely put that in your contract for editorial fees. Sometimes they will be paid and sometimes they will not. For independent clients and advertising clients, absolutely put that in your contract, and usually they will have to pay it.
Thank you. I think that's super helpful. I see that we are approaching the time. Are there any burning questions that we haven't touched on? Because again, there's so many different aspects to the business side that we could touch on. But I want to be mindful of Ariel's time. So if you have any remaining questions that just came up for you, please drop it in the chat now. Again, if you haven't watched last week's chat with Jane, please do so, because it touches on how to work with photo editors, how to work with Bloomberg specifically. And also I've held previous conversation. One that was really great was with Tracy Woods, who was the photo director at Essence, about how to, approach that and how to work with like other publications like Essence. And so please catch up to those conversations, because there are a lot of helpful tips with that. Because I see, I'm saying that because I see your question, Evelyn, about how do you even get to land these bigger jobs? And that is like a whole hour conversation in itself. But our previous conversations, like with Jane, with Tracy Woods, with JD Barnes, who's the chief photographer at Essence, they all touched on that, of how to, get that work. And most of one easy answer right now, I think Ariel mentioned it, but it definitely, Jane touched on this, was, personal projects, personal work is really, it's so vital. It's what will help you get hired. And yeah, I'll drop it again in the chat. I'll drop that in again in the chat, the link to rewatch.
Yeah, super quickly on that subject, that like shoot, and like get in touch with as many photo editors as you can, and yeah, don't be afraid to show personal work. Like that's really the work that's going to get you hired, versus kind of sometimes people sort of show what they consider like commercial work, and people really want to see what you're passionate about, again, because everybody has a love of the image and love of photography, and like really wants to see like what you're passionate about. Mm-hmm. And also editorial work, like the reason why people are willing to do it, like even like big photographers, is because everybody looks at editorial work and everybody looks at social media, and that's where art buyers are trying to find work for like their advertising clients, and everybody's kind of like looking at this at those same worlds. And so just to like put a little pitch in for the value of editorial in terms of like money making. Editorial will, there was, when I, at the agency that I worked at, there was like a real big philosophy that like editorial is what gets you the ad jobs. And so that's really it.
If you don't mind, while I have you here real quickly, because I asked this to Jane, and I try to ask this to everyone who's in this position to hire, what are you particularly looking for when it comes to, working with photographers? How can they stand out amongst the noise of social, the crowd of just, look, we have at least 40 photographers in here. So it's like, how can they stand out, right? And what are you particularly looking for when you are trying to hire?
We hire a lot of photographers. And so oftentimes, for me at least, I'm trying to find somebody that is going to bring a unique like way of telling the story to a particular story. Also, we hire a lot of local photographers. And so I think there's also kind of like there's kind of like this idea that like if you live like to make it big or something, you have to be in California or New York or something like that. And I think we hire all over the place. So geography is really important. Going back to personal projects as well, knowing what you're passionate about as well. Like we do so many weird stories. Like I'm sure Jane showed you like rocks, like a lot of rocks that Jane does. So like if you're really into rocks, we'll be like, oh my God, there was like Tiffany, like she's like super into, she's super into like quartz and like knows all this stuff about it. And then like next thing you know, you're like shooting, a whole quartz mining story for Business Week. So like, being pretty transparent about the things that you're really interested in, so that when I'm like, oh, I need this shot, like who's into this? Oh yeah, like I saw this on her Instagram, or and I know she's going to bring like a unique vision to it. I think that's kind of like what we look for.
Thank you. And a great comment from her colleague Leonore in the chat that folks should take a second to read. And I see one more question from Elsie. Do you think if we are more transparent with each other about our pricing, that would help the industry?
I'm pretty transparent about more or less everything. I think transparency always helps. I think it doesn't totally serve people to have a lot of like opaqueness around that. feel like that's a bit of a vestige of, you know, like, I don't know, times past. And I like really don't totally get it if I'm being completely, just like me saying this as like a human being. And so, yeah, I think that that is really helpful. And I think it also helps to build trust so that like when a client comes to you and they're like, I only have $3,000 for this shoot, you understand that they're not, you know, it's like, I only have $3,000 for this shoot. So yeah. Also just going back to like working with new clients as well. I love a good collaboration. I love, you know, working collaboratively, and also like there's so many photographers out there that like, I don't have a tolerance for jerks. Like I just want to work with nice, good people that like are just nice, good people. And so like that's another, it seems so self-evident and yet it's so not. And you know, I think that's, I really love a good person. So that's
people want to work with people they like and who are nice.
And just nice. Yeah.
Yes.
Just nice.
Thank you. Let's see. I think that just about does it. I think there was like maybe one more follow-up question, if you have the time. It comes back to the contract aspect. You mentioned some terms like work for hire and what that means. Are there anything else that we should watch out for in contracts, in terms of language that, you know, we should be aware of?
That's really the big one. Oh, sorry, Lenore, what were you gonna say? Oh,
Sorry.
I think that's really the big one that I think if you're coming to it for the first time, you wouldn't necessarily understand what that means. But again, like most contracts are pretty, they're sort of tedious to listen to, but they, read, but they're pretty straightforward. Like the, you know, the language in them is pretty straightforward. But again, if you have questions about anything, you know, just mark it and ask the client and say like, what, like, I'm so sorry, I don't actually understand what this means. Can you clarify this for me? So, yeah.
Thank you. If there are no other burning questions, I'll give it a second. But if there are no other burning questions, again, I will add this to the site. So to those who are members of Black Women Photographers, you'll know where to go. It's in the recap page. Everyone else, feel free to, you know, subscribe to the YouTube, go on our YouTube channel, and you'll see this available. I will send it out as an unlisted link. For you can replay it if you weren't able to jot down all the notes. I know it's a lot of information, but and feel free to, you know, tell us what else you want to know of. We're doing a series of how-tos with Bloomberg, and so there's, you know, we did how to pitch, and now we did the business side. So if there's things that you want them to touch on in our next chat, let us know. I'll be sending out Ariel's information. Like I sent with James, of if you want to get in touch with Ariel after, and I'll get those resources from you, like the template that we mentioned as well. So that will be included. So Ariel, did you have any last words?
I think that's it. And actually I have to go because I'm late for another meeting. I'm sorry.
So sorry. No, you're totally fine.
No, it's my fault. I talked too much. All right. Thank you guys so much. And please get in touch.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.